Thanks everybody for coming. Tonight I'm going to tell you how I came to own half of a floor in a factory building near Aberdeen. I'll also describe the renovation process, the hunt for a business to put into that space, and what it was like to work there for 5 years before I finally decided to sell it in 2010. I live in Pokfulam, and on the weekends my family would often drive down to Repulse Bay, Sheko, Stanley, and places like that on the south side of Hong Kong Island. And that trip would take us through Wong Chuk Hang, which, if you're not familiar with it, is a series of factory buildings sandwiched between working-class Aberdeen and Shou Sun Hill, which is one of Hong Kong's toniest and most exclusive neighborhoods. On those trips, I couldn't help but notice how out of place Wong Chuk Hang seemed in Hong Kong's new modern service-based economy. And from reading the newspapers, I knew that Hong Kong's industrial base had been gradually shifting to southern China, so I thought that these factory buildings might actually represent a redevelopment opportunity. I spent a couple of Sunday mornings wandering around in these industrial buildings, and at first I felt a little bit nervous as a Gweilo doing that, but I acted like I belonged there, and then I enlisted the help of my secret weapon, my then 5-year-old daughter. With the two of us wandering around, nobody batted an eye. I was looking for space that would be an interesting place to work in, and that would also offer the potential for capital gains. And one of the first things that I learned was that Hong Kong industrial space has got more in common with a scene from a Charles Dickens novel than it does with what you might find in a New York loft. Some buildings offer big windows and high ceilings, but you can forget about interesting architectural details like pressed tin ceilings and hardwood floors, ornate ironwork, and beautiful brickwork as well. You're not going to find that here in Hong Kong. I looked at dozens of industrial spaces, and many of them were frankly pretty horrible. Prices for industrial space here in Hong Kong fell dramatically in the wake of the Asian financial crisis in 1997, and then prices were hit again as China opened its doors to Hong Kong manufacturers, and they started moving across the border to Shenzhen. That left a lot of people who bought factory space in negative equity and made them even less inclined to spend money on maintenance and repairs than they would ordinarily be. Also, because these were factories, there wasn't really a lot of emphasis on aesthetics. Most of them were pretty ugly and quite dirty as well. Eventually, I found a unit that had been home to the New China Steam Laundry, and it was about 3,500 square feet, and it was on the back side of this building here. It took up about half of a floor. So I made an offer, which was verbally accepted. However, at the last minute, there was a quote-unquote problem with my offer, and the vendor pulled the property off the market. Curiously enough, a week later, the agent called me back and said the problem had been resolved. But now there was a new vendor, because the agent had actually found a confirmer who was happy to sell the property to me, but now the price was $260,000 more than I had originally planned on paying. At that point, I called the banks and did a little bit of research to find out about getting a mortgage. And between what the below market valuations that the banks were offering, the low loan to valuation ratios, and the above prime interest rates that they were asking for, it quickly became apparent that I was going to be paying cash if I was going to buy this property. So despite feeling like I had quite literally and figuratively been taken to the cleaners, I went ahead with the deal, and on April 19th, 2005, I signed a provisional sale and purchase agreement. My next challenge was to find an application for this new space, and I had two goals here. First, I wanted to generate some cash with a new business, and with that new business, I wanted something that was going to be hands-off. And second, I wanted to use the space, which was zoned as industrial, as a place for me to work from and to put my office. The last bit is important because the zoning regulations dictate what you can and cannot do with industrial space. And in general, putting an office in a factory building is forbidden unless the office is related to an industrial activity that's taking place there and the office occupies a relatively small proportion of the overall floor space. It's possible to change zoning from industrial to commercial, but this is expensive, it's time-consuming, and it's usually done on an en-bloc or whole building basis like the building that you can see here. The building here on your left is the Tin Quan Metal Manufactory, which has now been converted into BT Center, which houses a golf school and a variety of other non-industrial businesses. And this is right in beautiful downtown Wong Chuk Hang. So I looked at a variety of businesses that had been used to repurpose industrial space elsewhere, things like practice studios for musicians and self-storage facilities, and ultimately I dismissed these ideas because they would require a large investment in renovations and equipment, but they would also require me getting involved with a retail clientele and hiring extra staff, and I really wasn't terribly interested in doing that. So I got the neighborhood zoning plan, and I discovered that a multimedia production studio was an approved application. So as part of that, I could actually have an office, so I decided to build a rental studio. Now, before I tell you about the process of building the studio, let me describe and show you what the place looked like when I bought it. To say that it was a little bit rough would be something of an understatement. The previous tenant had removed all the internal partitions, the electrical outlets, and the lighting, but they did leave behind a lot of garbage. And it was astonishingly dirty. One corner previously held a boiler, and it was just black with soot. The factory did have some charms, though. The ceilings were 12 feet high, and as you can see here, there was lots of natural light because we had some good southern exposure. The factory also had a really nice green view, which you might not expect in Wong Chuk Hang. A family of eagles lived in this building, this tall building here on the left, and at dusk there was several hundred egrets that would come out to feed on the fish that used to live in the nullah here. From my window you could also see Wong Chuk Hang Estates, which was a 1960s era housing project that used to house some 15,000 people who worked in all of these factory buildings. This estate has now been completely demolished to make room for the MTR's new South Island line, and there'll be a bit more about that in a second. So at the end of May 2005, I took possession of the factory, and while the deal was closing, I did some research and learned how other people had converted old factories in Canada, the Philippines, the United States, and the UK into studios. I shamelessly borrowed and stole a bunch of their ideas, created a multilingual website, created a marketing plan, and did an interior design. I decided to divide the interior space into two, putting in a brick wall, which is this red line that you can see, and also building a small meeting room. And we also installed a kitchenette, a toilet, and a shower, and the office area did double duty as a daylight studio because of all that beautiful sunlight. Here you can see the wall going up that separated the daylight studio from the main studio. Now, when you renovate an industrial space, you can work 24/7 without having to worry about annoying the neighbors, which we did. This is the main studio before we finished the floors. So on July 1, 2005, we moved in, and Dillon Studios opened for business. And here's what the main studio looked like when we finished with it. We installed new windows, which we put black film on so that photographers could control the light. We put a lighting grid in the ceiling with a special pipe that you can hang lights and props from. And we added a selection of background papers, stands, and a variety of other accessories. We also put in makeup stations with salon chairs, a powerful sound system so you could make lots of noise while you were working. And we put in a green screen so that you could shoot video and add and subtract backgrounds electronically. Here's the reception area with the entrance to the bathroom and the kitchenette just here on the right. And here's our client lounge. The daylight studio, as I mentioned before, had a lot of light, and we really didn't need to turn on any overhead lights unless we were actually working in there at night. And finally, here's my office, which was down the far end of the daylight studio. It was a very, very pleasant place to work. Altogether, the conversion took 2 months and cost about 250,000 Hong Kong dollars, and that includes material and labor with me providing the design. Now, in hindsight, the studio was both a success and it was a failure. And it was a failure because if I had been renting that space from another landlord and counting on the revenue from studio rentals to feed my family, the numbers simply didn't work. We had some great clients like Sony, MTV, Vidal Sassoon. We even had De Beers in there for 9 days, where guys would show up every morning with a bag full of diamonds and a shotgun, which was more than a little bit entertaining. And we also had some photographers and some production companies who treated Dillon Studios as their home studio. But there simply wasn't enough business at a high enough rate to make it commercially viable. I could have increased the volume by doing open shoots, which is something that's very, very common here in Hong Kong, where you hire a model and then you charge amateur photographers a couple of $100 Hong Kong dollars each to shoot the model for an hour. But frankly, that wasn't worth the time or the aggravation involved, I thought. And the studio could have also been more viable if I had been a professional photographer and I had a steady stream of traffic coming through there, but I wasn't. So that really limited it. So that was the downside. Dillon Studios, though, was a success in several other key respects. First of all, it gave me an opportunity and an ability to work out of an industrial building for 5 years while property prices were rising in the neighborhood. And also, I learned an enormous amount about real estate over the course of the process, and those lessons went into 2 books that I wrote, one about Hong Kong, and then a second one, most recently, about Japan. I also had met some great people and threw some fairly amusing parties as well. So at this point, I'd like to tell you a little bit about what it was like to work in one of these buildings. Because if you've seen movies, and movies shot in New York lofts, they all look sort of romantic and really funky and everything else. The reality is slightly different. If you're used to working in an office tower in Central, the best analogy I might give you is that it would be like moving from an apartment in mid-levels to a village home in the New Territories. You've got more space, but you're physically removed from things, and you need to slow down and adapt yourself to new surroundings. Environmental issues are one of the most important realities that you've got to get your head around. Factory buildings can be noisy during a day, especially if your neighbors are one of the few businesses here that still make things. An industrial space is not designed to be quiet. There's lots of hard parallel surfaces and very little in the way of acoustic insulation or isolation. So that makes these spaces less than ideal if you're shooting video with sound or if you need quiet to do whatever it is that you're planning on doing. There are also health and safety concerns, such as a lack of fire sprinklers in most of these industrial places. And in many old buildings, they used to use, and in some instances continue to use, toxic chemicals. These units are sold on an as-is basis, and there are no guarantees that those toxic chemicals have been properly remediated when you buy them. So caveat emptor. Heating and air conditioning is also an issue. High ceilings and large open spaces are very expensive to heat and cool, especially when it's 35 degrees outside. So you may want to budget for internal partitions. Second, maintenance and repairs can be a major problem. Many industrial units are owned by investors who are waiting for the building or the entire neighborhood to be redeveloped. And the unit may be empty because the rents are not worth the landlord's worthwhile to get a tenant in there and deal with the aggravation there. And it's also easier to sell property like this if it's not tenanted. Even if the unit does have a tenant, many owners are absolutely loath to spend money on maintenance and repairs, even if it's maintenance and repairs that the building's owners committee has legally passed a resolution to have completed. Lawsuits are very often used to force owners to pay for those essential repairs to things like electrical systems, lifts, and leaky roofs. At one point, our owners committee passed a resolution to start a renovation program. The plans were all approved. The committee began collecting money from the various owners. And after months of meetings and negotiations, the plan was eventually abandoned because some owners simply refused to pay up. Deposits were eventually returned to those who cooperated, and the repairs were completed some 3 years later. But over the course of those 3 years, the building continued to deteriorate. Incidentally, those repairs cost about 140,000 Hong Kong dollars in the end, and they only covered the bare essentials. And they left a number of very significant things unfixed, like lifts that needed to be replaced. So you'll want to budget for some general building repairs in addition to the buying and the fitting out process. A lot of these buildings were erected as cheaply as possible in that wonderful Hong Kong fashion. And that's reflected in the building's fit and finish. For example, in my studio, the floors weren't level and the exterior walls leaked. So if I came in on a Monday morning after a weekend when there had been heavy rain, like a black or a red rainstorm warning, I'd find puddles on the floor throughout the studio. At one point, we had a pipe break in the fire sprinkler system, and we had a minor flood. These things don't happen every day in every building, but they're far from unusual. This picture here illustrates 2 very common problems with industrial buildings. Cracks, shown here with the red arrow, and spalling with the green arrow. This picture was taken before I moved in, and these problems were fixed repeatedly while I was there, but the problems would keep reappearing because there was underlying structural problems. Water would come through the concrete and push off the patches, and they would patch up the cracks and the plaster would just fall out. It was just the nature of the beast. And that's because even when repairs are made, they're generally made again, as cheaply as possible. So you'll see elevators that really needed to have been replaced that are repaired over and over and over again, despite the fact that ultimately it's nothing but false economy. Trying to fight this is a waste of time. You're only going to annoy your neighbors, so suck it up. Over the years, there's been a real shift in the nature of the companies that occupy these industrial spaces. If you've been here for a while, you know that Hong Kong used to have a very vibrant light manufacturing sector, and those companies have largely left Hong Kong. But there are still some left. Printers, commercial laundries, food factories, warehouses, distribution centers, people like that. They're few and far between, but there are still some here. As neighbors, some of these businesses are far more desirable than others. If you're thinking of buying and occupying an industrial space, you really want to find out who is in the building now and get the zoning documents to find out who could be in the building later on. I was lucky. The company that I shared a floor with made a traditional Chinese medicine that used peppermint oil as one of its main ingredients. So when they were busy mixing this, my office could smell like a cross between an aromatherapy salon and a candy shop. A little later, however, a meat wholesaler moved in and rented a high floor in the building. And each morning they'd load trucks with frozen chicken, beef, and fish that would be delivered to restaurants all over Hong Kong. In the afternoon, they'd receive 45-foot containers of frozen food from Canada, Brazil, and the United States. That meant that the freight elevators were permanently engaged, and pallets of frozen meat would be left in the elevators where they would slowly melt, leaving puddles of blood on the floor, much to the delight of the local cockroach population. The people who occupy industrial buildings can also be a little bit rough. I was never concerned about my safety, and I never had any issues with thefts or anything like that, but we did have issues with things like obscene graffiti in the freight elevators. Four-letter words aren't going to bother me, but if you've got clients who are a little bit delicate of sensibilities, it might be something to keep in mind. You also may find that you're the building's only Guilo owner. And owners' committee meetings are generally in buildings like this are conducted in Cantonese. So if you're not bilingual, you'll need to send a delegate, or you'll have to rely on the good sense and natural stinginess of your fellow owners. Generally speaking, you don't have to worry about them putting in marble lobbies and fancy chandeliers. They tend to be pretty cheap. You may also have trouble finding places to eat lunch nearby. In some industrial neighborhoods, the only F&B outlets are canteens, and those factory canteens are closed to the general public. Despite these challenges, I really enjoyed the 5 years that I spent working here, and planning and executing the renovation was probably one of the most interesting projects that I've undertaken. One of the things that I really enjoyed was the announcement that the MTR was going to be building the South Island line right outside my front window. As you might imagine, that had a positive effect on valuations. The price increase and the realization that the neighborhood was going to be turned upside down for several years as the railway line was being built prompted me to sell. It also reinforced one of the most important lessons that I've learned speculating in property, which is that it's always better to sell into a rising market. It's much easier to offload things. So that's what I did. The studio was easy to sell because it showed well. And that's unusual in Hong Kong because most of the time when people buy property here, they really don't care what the inside looks like because they're going to gut it anyhow. But this looked so much better than anything else that was around there that I had literally people knocking at my door to buy. It was quite easy to sell. So that, in a nutshell, is my experience owning industrial property here in Hong Kong. But before I wrap up, I'd like to address one question that many people ask in presentations like this, which is that, can I convert one of Hong Kong's old factories into a loft apartment? And the answer is yes, you can. But the problem is you can't legally live there. For the record, I don't recommend breaking the law, and I would like to be very clear about that. But if you do want to live in a factory building, and I know several people who've done it over the years, there are a few things that you need to know. First, you've got to remember the noise and the environmental issues that I mentioned. You'll want to think very carefully before you expose yourself and your family to asbestos and other dangerous substances that were used in many of these buildings. And that's particularly true if you've got small children, because small children are affected to a much greater degree by environmental contamination than full-size adults are. Second, government inspectors will appear every couple of months and knock on your door. We had regular visits from immigration, fire, the buildings department, and it was never a problem for us. I always said, come on in and have a look around, and they were always cool with it, but I wasn't living there. And if they discovered you were living there, it might be a problem. If they decided to prosecute, you could be liable for fines. You could also suffer a loss if the government decides to start more rigorously enforcing the laws that are on the books, or introduces new regulations for that matter. And also, you're going to want to make an effort to maintain good relations with your neighbors, because they can rat you out if you're living there and they decide they don't like the cut of your jib. So in summary, if you want to buy industrial property in Hong Kong, you want to remember that most of these properties are utilitarian boxes, not the loft conversions you see in Hollywood movies. You should be prepared to pay cash or borrow on terms that are less favorable than you'd get for a residential mortgage. You'll need to pay attention to zoning and the activities of your neighbors. If you don't, you could find yourself working downwind from a fish paste factory. These factory buildings can be noisy, and they can suffer from environmental contamination and, as I mentioned, poor maintenance. You'll need to make an effort to fit in, and remember that it's illegal to try and live in one of these places. If you can get your head around these issues, you may discover that owning industrial property is not only entertaining and interesting, but it can be profitable too. Thank you.